we'll start with an introduction. Vanessa.
Yes.
Please.
Vanessa Eriksson. I've just joined PwC a month ago. PwC needs no introduction. It's an accounting company, it's an auditing company, tax reforms, and business consulting. I come from the data and analytics part of it, and previously I've been at Telia as Chief Data Officer for Division X, which spearheads innovation in the company, and before that at Eurasia, Chief Data Officer. At PwC, I'm heading the Chief Data Officer Advisory Panel Services. I've also, just like to add, been part of Gartner's Chief Data Officer Advisory Board for several years. And my biggest asset is convincing management to do as I say.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa.
Excellent. I'm Nicola Askham. I'm known as the data governance coach. I'm a data management consultant. I do primarily data governance, but I often get drawn into master data management and data quality. I've been doing data governance for 14 years, but I did it where most of you are now. I made it up as I went along whilst working as a permanent employee of a bank first in the UK before becoming a consultant. So I kind of feel your pain, and now I just hopefully help people solve those pains by telling them not to do it how I was doing it in the early days.
Thank you.
So I'm Jean-Michel Franco. I'm a data professional since a couple of years. You know, when it's more than 20, you tend to underestimate the number. And I'm working at Talend, being in charge of the data governance solution. So I'm a solution provider, but meeting a lot of customers and sharing and learning also from their data governance experience.
Thanks.
Darius, Clayton. Historically, I've spent 20 years in the industry, usually working in large-scale transformation programs in my early days, and I got upset with the fact that the one thing that we never fixed was the data. So around a decade ago, I got into that space, decided that software was required for it, and became the co-founder of a company called Diaku that makes a software product called Askham for data governance. We were acquired by Informatica in January of this year, so now 9 months into my Informatica piece. And what I bring is a very practical approach to data governance that's driven from kind of the business need for better data.
Thank you. So I will take the opportunity to start with a question from my side. And what do you think is the number one key challenge when it comes to establishing data governance in practice?
Shall I begin?
You can begin, please.
Coming from Telia's Division X, where Division X is a company within a company, only to spearhead. We had the ICA head tell us earlier also they had ICA X, and Division X is doing a lot of innovation, and I know from talking to other customers that there's a lot of companies that are actually working in the same fashion. And imagine now when you're doing innovation, you've got partners, you've got third parties. The model is so different. When you're doing governance, data governance with enterprise, you've got models, you've got frameworks that you can adapt to your company. But when you're doing innovation like this, I mean, look at the model. Who owns the data? We had devices that came from China. We had devices that came from a provider in Germany. And everyone told me, the data is mine. It's my sensor. And I said, bugger off. Because, previously when you're doing data governance, you had to really convince the business, this is your data and you're going to take it. This is customer data. But today it's a different ballgame. Everybody knows how important it is to have the data. So now you have the other effect where everybody's saying, I'll take it. This is mine. So it's a new data governance model you're looking at, and you've got to think smart. Who owns the data? And there's no one model, because every time you do innovation or a POC or a POV, your model is going to be different because your partners, your players are different. So I think there's a big challenge coming on.
I think you're very mean saying just one. Not that I want to put you off, but there's one or two. If I had to pick one, probably the hardest one I face is the cultural change side of it. I think people think that you can throw tools. Sorry, if you're a software vendor, just cover your ears up. You can throw tools at it, or you can, just throw money at it. But it's a cultural change that you need to achieve. I went to a conference in London a few years back where, I don't know if people have heard of Peter Aitken. He was the Dharma Eye president for a while. He's excellent at presenting on data. If you ever get the chance to hear him, I would say go for it. But he stood up in a packed room like this and he said, the trouble with data is that people think of it in the same way they think about air. And everybody looked at him like you're looking at me. Going, well, I don't think about air. Exactly. You got up this morning, you jumped in the shower, you grabbed your cup of coffee. You might have got your phone out and checked the trains or the roads, but who checked the air quality? And, it's only when you're laying on the floor, clutching your chest, saying there's not enough oxygen, that you go, oh, I think there's a problem with the air. And people are the same about data. So that kind of just resonated and stuck with me when Peter said that. And it is that problem we have. If you go and talk to people in your organization and say, what's your job? How many of them, apart from maybe the BI or data analytics team, would say data? But yet, it doesn't matter what industry I've worked with, there is data involved. And when the data goes wrong, other things go wrong. So what you've got to achieve is that cultural change where people start thinking about their data as part of their day-to-day job instead of waiting until it goes wrong and then running around and panicking and trying to fix it.
Thanks.
So I'll take accountability. So we are hearing more and more kind of horror story in headlines about the dark side of data. So recently it was Equifax, we had Sony, we had Target, so data leaks, privacy violations, wrong data being injected for alternative facts and things like that. But it's a kind of like global warming, It's we know that there's a problem, but we feel that it's outside. It's not within our company. And so, if I take the privacy example, until the government puts 4% of your overall revenue at risk with a law, then you tend to focus on that. Then you tend to put the organization. Then you tend to get the budget from the execs, etc. And so that's this big issue of how can we put some people accountable. And it's not only top down. It's not only having the execs on. It's also it's a collective problem, but it's also a personal problem. And if you take for example, customer data, if you're in B2B, probably the people that are on the field, the account executives, the account responsible, the marketing, should be responsible of the data quality of the data that corresponds to their customer, because that's their lifeblood. That's how they can contact their customer. That's how. And so that's this difficult accountability thing that has to be put in place in a data governance program.
Thanks.
So I think there's a theme, actually. So if we kind of go down the row, it's people want to own the data, but I want it for me, like it's mine. I want to claim ownership, and I don't want to share that with you. You can't have it. Bugger off is a great answer to that, by the way. Or it's, I don't know that I do data for a living. I think I do something else, so I'm not sure what my responsibilities are. Or it's struggling with accountability. And in general, what's happening is that people are doing the work around data in a misstructured or very kind of siloed way. But they are doing work around data. You'll find people that even if they don't have the job of data owner or data steward, that they're facilitating those roles. But it's about, for me, the biggest obstacle, it's about participation in a shared collaborative function, because all of those things are part of that same thematic problem. And it's being able to articulate the value, the what's in it for me, participating in that work, and being able to share that collaboration and the value across the organization. The organization traditionally is not particularly well structured for that. We might call them silos or functions or center of excellences, but we've got to get past that siloed, localized mentality. And so there's this big bridging function that's a responsibility of any good data practitioner.
Thanks. I have a question before we let the audience in here. And my experience when it comes to information governance is that we're talking about the most important information. assets or objects like customer products and so on. Typical master data. And we all know that they are not one-to-one with the current structure that we have in a company. What I'm meaning with that, organization is one part of it. It differs in total when it comes to those objects. Another thing is the corporate governance. And when it comes to corporate governance and information governance, there are a lot of obstacles I see how to make them fit together. Do you have any experiences or thoughts about that?
That's a tough question. I suppose that in my experience, I always tend to try and find your compliance team, your up-risk team, because they're the ones doing the more corporate governance. I wouldn't profess to be an expert in those, but I find they're good allies in trying to implement data governance, because it's hard enough to do data governance, not that I want to put you off it. You should do it. But you might as well use existing structures to help leverage it and make it easier. So yeah, that was how I would go about aligning them and using what you've already got for corporate governance to build upon or build out data governance from.
Yeah, I was thinking what Vanessa said, that everyone wants to own their own data. But for example, maybe we could create customer data in several different parts of our organization and different parts in different processes as well. So who should own it if that type of structure is totally different from the corporate structure?
So in my experience, you end up with people who are responsible for it at that stage in its life cycle. So if I'm responsible for creating a piece of data, I'm responsible for it in that part of its life. Then there is, a strategic source for it, and you might have somebody who's got perhaps a broader, more central responsibility, and this person is a satellite for it until such time as you can fix the organization or the creation or the centralization of those things to help fit the right structures. Again, back to Nicola's point that if you leverage what's there, you can find people who are responsible for a given system or a given process, and you can kind of tack on responsibilities for that until such time as you can get in more appropriate structures that give you that enterprise level view.
So a prerequisite for success then is to link it to the corporate governance structure that we already have in-house.
I think it's an important point here. You can't change the entire organization so that the responsibilities are around the data. There's an existing, very change-resistant organization and structure and set of people. But what you can do is you can take advantage of those things to embed the data responsibilities and these collaborative roles inside there. And I think that that's a key indicator of success, is lowering the barrier to adoption.
Yeah, thanks.
I think also it's not so much a matter of ownership, but what are the stakes. So if you take customer data, the marketing now begins to understand that when they do a campaign and the 20% of the campaign goes nowhere, it's a waste of time, it's ruining their... So then they can be accountable of part of the data quality. And same for the sales. And so you need to make clear stakes so that you can engage the different people. And that's hard in enterprise things. So when you try to do something that are cross-organization, you need to have the engagements and you need to find the stakes. And for me, what are the successful program in data governance are when the business stakes are clear at the operation level.
Yeah. Okay, here we have a question or idea or thought.
I was a little bit curious about the things about ownership, because it comes back to ownership. I work in the financial industry, and I really can see that sometimes the ownership is something you don't want. The customer they want to own, but all the support processes someone else owns. But you said, if I understood you correctly, that the ownership should actually change while we add and enhance the information. Is that correct?
That ownership is not something... So to take a quick clarification, if you have somebody who's responsible for data up here, how can they exert the relevant authority and ensure that going through the line, the more operational tasks are sustained and maintained and they're doing the right things? The more senior the person is, the less they have their hands in and the less they really understand of the detail. So as you're dealing with data, as you pass the baton to somebody else, you need to make sure that it's taken care of as it goes through. In some cases, those might be roles that you would say could be supported as a custodian activity or as a steward role. In some cases, you might call them ownership. I think the key thing is you need to have a set of responsibilities for data in the aggregate, but also as it flows through, so that you can trust the flow of information through your business and the use of it as it cascades through the organization. Does that help?
So yeah, so basically, if I understand it correctly, not using the word ownership in that sense, because I think, at least in our organization, it's a little bit dangerous.
Right. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't matter what you call it. The responsibility is to make sure that it's taken care of as it flows through, whatever fits with the language that people will buy into in your organization. Nicola said that the names aren't important. It's making sure that they do the job.
Thank you. Here, another one.
Hi, guys. So I had a question on mandate, and so what is your recommendations on how to, if you consider a CDO organization that is central to a company, and how you apply mandate to that organization versus kind of normal business line. So I'll give you an example. So if we have a data quality lead that has a fantastic framework for data quality and wants to talk to that business line to implement, let's say, restrict in interface in your front end systems, you should restrict the input values because that will give me better data quality down the line, right? And that business line is like, okay, that's a great idea, but these are my business priorities, these are my budget. Okay, we have a policy, but at the end of the day, the budget is what I have to adhere to. So how do you handle kind of mandate?
So that's something that I did mention earlier. So I agree with you, and I've suffered from that in the past of not having, well, doing it on a best endeavours basis for a while until somebody says, oh, I'm busy, I've got other priorities have changed. So I think that one of the first things you do once you've got approval, whether you have to have a business case or you just have an executive sponsor who agrees to do it, is to get a policy in place that's agreed, a corporate policy that says we will do data governance, we will manage our data better. And I found that without it, it's very hard to keep it on people's agenda, unless you got things like GDPR, which tends to focus people's minds a little. But you know, in a couple of years' time, we'll be looking for whatever else it is to keep it. But I do like adding that. I suppose it goes back to the earlier question, that adding it to the corporate governance, making it a requirement for your organisation to comply with that. Because then I can be the good guy coming around and helping you comply with it, and we can blame internal audit for coming and telling you when you're not complying with the policy.
And yet, I think also you might have a policy, and nothing is written in stone. So things will change. And as a chief data officer, you have the mandate to say, yes, if it actually affects the business and it's got to change, then it's got to change. It's as simple as that. Because, when we were doing definitions, I had somebody scream at me and say, don't come and change the way we do work here. But you just have to adapt because businesses change. So you have to have the mandate, and I think as a chief data officer, you have that mandate.
I've seen places where there is a mandate, but the mandate doesn't have any teeth. There is a policy, and the policy doesn't have teeth. And I think in your example, you're saying, well, I've got those things, but it's kind of, you have the mandate, you just don't have the muscle behind you to enforce the mandate. And I think that's probably a pretty common thing. In this event, part of the reason why we want to be able to connect between things is that other parts of the business are your friend. If they won't fix it because it's not valuable to them, it is valuable to someone else. If you can find a heavy hitter who's actually the impacted party and they can apply organizational pressure, you end up being a facilitator, a referee between the various factions or fiefdoms of your business. And what you want to do is you want to be able to say, well, the right answer is going to be based upon what should be best for the organization. So you facilitate it, you expose those things, and you get people to apply the appropriate pressure. So we've done that in places, and Nicola's example was getting internal audit to be the pressure-applying party. But if you're in reporting, maybe you're risk-weighted assets or something in banking, and you use that as the stick. But it's always that balancing of priorities, and not saying we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. I can demonstrate why.
Yeah. So, Martin next.
Darius, one of the things you mentioned is obviously the data supply chain and how data crosses organisational boundaries. What operating models have you found works well to facilitate sort of root cause analysis? Because it's always somebody else's problem.
Transparency. Number one thing is transparency. If you can't visualize the impact, then you're never going to fix it. So kind of when we were going through the sort of the maturity path for data governance, we said visibility is the first thing. Because again, it comes back to that framework of even if you've got the mandate, even if you've got the policy, you've got to be able to see those impacts and see that the cost of fixing those impacts is less than the benefit that it will realize. And so you've got to be able to bring those things together. As you mature, you can put in more standard functions, or you can start to align people to more structured roles and responsibilities. But in those early stages, it really is about getting the right people together and being able to articulate in meaningful business ways the nature of the problem. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
Yes, I think that in physical supply chains, they have fixed the problem with things like Six Sigma and things like that. So finding the measures and then going back to the root cause and engaging the people that are upstream within the supply chain. So I think on data, we are at the beginning of the story. So we still miss the indicator, etc. But we need to collect those kind of things and to be able to come back to the top of the chain. So we have an example in mind. So working with a retailer in UK, and so they first found that data quality once they were going in e-commerce, they are in do-it-yourself. So for example, if you sell a paint and the color of the paint is not defined, you'll never sell that in e-commerce. So they found that the outcome was the conversion rate in terms of sales. But then it's about who inputs the color of the paint. And they were able to go back to the supplier to say, okay, if you want to work with me to sell your paint, then you have to input the right data into the system. So that's the kind of supply chain that we have to implement, I think, in a data chain. That's hard, I know. But when you can find an outcome like the 30% conversion rates of sales in e-commerce, like in my example, then you can have the money to implement that.
Hi, just one question. Is it time for us to scrap the thoughts of one to rule them all in terms of master model, given the fact that we actually do have multiple viewpoints to data in all the practices and processes? Is it time to do that, or should we continue thinking that we actually can create one master model?
I think eventually the question becomes less relevant. So some of the work that we've been doing just in terms of our own product strategy is this idea of a polyglot model. We have this event-driven store. Here's the value. Here's the field. Here's a timestamp. And from that, we can construct anything that we want. You just have kind of all of these name-value pairs, and you can build the structures you want. You can adapt things there. The most important thing is for our ability to translate between those things. If you want to call them different stuff, if you want to have them stored in different structures, as long as we can automate and simplify the transfer and modification of that, it doesn't matter. So I think there's a path. Those constructs are valuable to us, but over time, as we get better at it, we'll be okay with that more federated view. That's my take.
Okay, let's sum it up. I would like each of you to sum it up with one key takeaway from this session.
I have a mic. I think people are an important part of the solution and probably also the primary problem in data governance. And so if we want to crack it, what we've got to do is find a way to bring people along for the ride until, by doing our jobs really well, we don't need 80% of them anymore.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I'll take the last question. So we've been looking a lot for the single version of the truth. And I think there's a new model which is getting a fair version of the truth. So if you look at other markets like the internet, and if you look at things like Wikipedia, they were able to establish practices around gathering knowledge where everyone can contribute, but then they have the moderation and the creation on top of that. And when you go to Wikipedia, you know that the information might not be perfect. But it's a fair version of the truth. So you believe that, and they were able to outperform top-down models like the traditional encyclopedia because they put more knowledge, and ultimately they got to better results. So I think this is inspiring for where we are going into data governance. How can we have some models that are more collaborative? That's my takeaway.
Thanks.
I was probably going to build on what Darius is saying, because I totally agree that people are the problem. It should be called people governance, not data governance. And I think it's this finding what you need to do to get people engaged and talking to you about managing their data better. So one thing I encourage people to do is go and find your data quality horror stories, because I can tell you, because I tried it for several years before I realized it wasn't working, telling people they should do it because it's best practice doesn't sell it. But if you find out what's gone wrong in your company and use your own internal examples, you suddenly get people going, oh, I don't want that to be my department that's next up for that, or that it's our organisation in the news for doing something wrong. So yeah, find your data quality horror stories and use them to engage people in the data governance process.
Thanks.
And I'd like to say, I mean, we all understand that data is an asset. A recent study in Denmark by PwC showed that 83% of companies identified that data as a top priority. However, just 12% were actually doing something about it. So while we all agree that this is critical for us, and Gartner predicts that by 2020 or 2019, the number of chief data officers will have been doubled and tripled. If you're looking at the Nordics, the trend is not picked. And, I'm asking the question, why? Why don't we have that here? Is it because, we have other people running around and doing the job? Or what is it? So I'm going to be standing there and holding a round table, and I'd love to hear your views. And because I believe that every company, you need to have a chief data officer to keep it all together and drive data forward.
Thank you so much.